1 Peter 5, we're dealing with a passage that's primarily directed towards, it's towards pastors, right? So this is a message that is, as I'm going to argue, as much for me as it is for you. It's as much for pastors as it is for the people of the church. Now, there are a lot of pastors today, and this is no secret, there are a lot of pastors today who don't belong in ministry. I would say that our society is loaded with guys who don't belong in ministry, and every once in a while, those guys get exposed. I think the most recent one that I can really think of, popular figure that I could think of, is Carl Lentz with Hillsong. Hillsong was some legitimate church in the first place. Come on, you should have known that one. You should have seen that one coming. But I can't wait to watch the documentary. I can't wait. I really am. Every week I think about it. I can't wait to watch the expose on this false church. But then, so there are guys like that, womanizing pastors and other problems. You think in terms of guys like Jimmy Swaggart and that stuff. Now that's generations ago. But then there are other pastors who they're struggling. Maybe some of those guys are, maybe some of those guys aren't legitimate, but they're struggling, and maybe some of them have forgotten why they're doing what they're doing. Some of them might be in ministry for financial reward, like the TV preachers. I can't help but think about, I actually have a recording, and I believe it's still on my phone. I kept a recording of a guy who was just basically saying that God is telling you to give money, and the more money you give, the more blessing you're going to get, and all this stuff. And I can't help but think about Benny Hinn saying, God has sent us to San Diego. But if you don't fill the seats in San Diego and sell out the tickets, then God hasn't sent us. And I'm like, what? Are you serious? How can people fall for this? How can people really be that? But people are that foolish in some cases. They follow these people. Some of these pastors see themselves as motivational speakers, and that was Carl Lentz. That's all he was a motivational speech. They did a rock concert followed by a motivational speech. That's all it was, and they called it church. Some of them will sit and seclude themselves in their ivory towers, remaining completely disconnected from the lives of their people. And that can happen to any pastor. That can happen to good pastors. These pastors, they need to hear what Peter says in this passage. And the church needs to hear it as well. Now, again, this passage isn't only for pastors are the primary audience, but it is for the everyday Christian. Today's Christian often fails to realize the authority structures that God has put in place. He fails to realize that these structures are kind of laid out in Scripture, right? And I think what ends up happening is it's like an individualistic, consumeristic Christianity, that people become their own chief shepherd, so to speak. So they become the expert. They become the pontiff of their own lives. And so a person like that will look for ways to attack and to criticize any spiritual leader, particularly even his own, that quote unquote competes for his influence. Now I see this sometimes with young guys. They maybe in young marriages or young families, and every once in a while I'll see a guy who really he uses his quote unquote spiritual leadership as a means for control, and controls his spouse or controls his family this way, and sees in his depraved thinking the pastor of the church or a spiritual leader as the guy who's competing for his control of his family. You just see how twisted this gets. This is out there. People need to see what Peter wrote here. Now, most of this letter is written to a greater population of Christians who are struggling with persecution, and they're suffering because of their faith. Today, Peter kind of zooms in on one particular group of people, and that is the spiritual leaders, the pastors of the churches. There isn't a pastor alive who isn't just a regular. I mean, listen, some of them put off like there's something different. You ever meet a pastor, you think, does that guy even sin? Okay, he puts it out like he's perfect. But I'm going to tell you right now, there isn't a pastor alive who isn't a regular guy who sins just like everyone else. Hopefully not some of the more serious sins. Hopefully not some of the more life-dominating sins that are sometimes present in people's lives. But I'm going to tell you, the pastors who put out the aura of perfection are the pastors that eventually you start seeing who they really are. And what that really is, it's just living a false public. You're just pretending to be something you're not. Eventually, truth comes out. Today, Peter is zooming in on leaders who are facing hardship, and they are the primary targets of Satan, really, and of the world, really. They're the first guys who in the first century are getting jailed and arrested. They're the first guys who are seeing persecution. And so Peter has an important charge to give to these pastors. But the first thing he does in this passage is to identify with them. He identifies with them as a figure of authority, as a person who shares their experience, as a model, and as an example for the church. He identifies with these pastors. Look at 1 Peter 5, verse 1. Now, actually, before we say that, sometimes, before we read that, sometimes you meet a person and you'll hear, like for instance, let's just say for the sake of the argument, I go to a Roman Catholic church and I go to my priest for, marriage counseling, right? And my priest tells me how I should, be sacrificial in the home and with my children and this and that. And the first thing I'm going to think is, well, you don't know the first thing about any of that. Am I right? There's like a disconnect in identifying with each other there. There's something about being able to identify with someone that can give a certain credence to what they're saying. So for instance, for me to get marriage counseling from a 17-year-old single is going to be different than me getting marriage counseling for someone who's been married 30 or 40 years, right? There's going to be an identification that for me might be like, I think I'm going to listen. Not like Rehoboam, right? The first king of the divided Judah. Not like Rehoboam, who listened to the advice of his cronies and young friends. But in this case, maybe listen to the advice of someone who can identify with my situation here. And so there's something like that happens here before Peter kind of really gets into what he's saying. And if you look at verse 1, 1 Peter 5, verse 1, therefore I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. So what we have here is, and I just want to highlight a few terms here. I exhort the elders among you. He calls them to come alongside of him. He's encouraging them to action, which we'll see what that action is. Now, if you notice how I have this, a lot of times I try not to show you what's coming because I want it to kind of be unveiled. So if you're tempted to read ahead, just don't yet. Oh yeah, we're going to get there. All right. So anyway, he's exhorting the elders among you, the elders of the churches. Now, this is a significant part of the context. It's significant to understanding New Testament church structure even. Our word presbytery comes from this word elder. Our word for priest actually comes from this word elder. In the Jewish world, elders were the senior members of the community, and they were people with great influence and among the population. In the New Testament, though, it's a reference to church leaders. That's what this term is. And we'll see that throughout the New Testament. We'll see that in this passage. Just give you an example or two. In Acts 14:23, at the end of Paul's first missionary journey, Paul appointed elders for them in every church. So Paul plants these churches. He plants churches in Antioch of Pisidia. He plants church in Lystra and Derbe. Iconium. And after having been stoned and dragged out of the city and left for dead, he actually ends up going back through all those towns and appoints elders, spiritual leaders in those churches. All right, so Paul sets up pastors in these churches. In Acts chapter 15, when there was a theological issue that needed to be resolved, the church at Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas to the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. All right, so there they were sent to apostles and pastors. The apostles and pastors ultimately heard and decided the matter that was at hand. All right, so the elders were really functioning as spiritual leaders alongside of the apostles who were functioning as pastors at the time. When Paul returned to Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey, he appeared before the elders, the pastors at Jerusalem in Acts 21:18. In 1 Timothy 5:17, Paul writes, "The elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching." And so we see that the elders of the church, they governed the church at some level. They led the church at some level, and they worked at preaching and teaching. So we see some of the responsibilities that the elders were carrying out here in Paul's first pastoral letter to Timothy, who was the pastor of the church at Ephesus. If we go back to 1 Peter 5 with a little bit of that New Testament context in mind, Peter identifies with these elders. "I exhort the elders among you," calling himself a fellow elder. And so Peter's really kind of doing the job of a pastor. And as a pastor, he understands what these pastors are going through. He understands the fear of persecution. He understands the pressure that society's putting upon them. He understands the burden of caring for people. And so he's not asking them to do something that he's not doing. He's giving them an exhortation as elders. He can identify with them. He is a fellow elder. He is a witness of the sufferings of Christ. He saw the opposition to Christ. He saw the betrayal of Christ. He saw the arrest of Christ. He was in Jerusalem for the trial. He was in the courtyard right outside for a portion of that trial. He was in Jerusalem when Jesus was brutally murdered and crucified. So he is a witness to the sufferings of Christ. But, some people look at this and they're not sure how to define this term. Is he a witness like an eyewitness? Or is he a witness like someone who is bearing witness, like he's giving testimony about the sufferings of Christ? And I'm not 100% sure. I think the first one is probably it. But we all know Peter told people about what happened to Christ. We see it in the early chapters of the book of Acts all over the place. He got imprisoned because he was a witness on behalf of the sufferings of Christ. Anyway, these pastors were doing the same thing. In spite of the consequences, they were bearing witness of the sufferings of Christ. Peter was a partaker of the glory that is to be revealed. Though he may face trouble and death now, Peter and the local church pastors will share glory in eternity. So suffering, we saw throughout this letter, suffering now and glory in eternity are themes that go hand in hand. We actually, just a few verses earlier, to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. And so in verse 1, Peter's really identifying with these pastors, all right? There's an exhortation, he's calling them to something, to do something, and he's doing it on the basis of the fact that he's a fellow elder with them. It's an identification with these local church pastors. And then he gives them the most important charge in verse 2. Shepherd, we'll just go right there. Shepherd the flock of God among you. I exhort the elders among you, shepherd the flock of God among you. And this is it's the only command in the paragraph. To shepherd the flock of God. Everything else in this paragraph revolves around this one command. And that word shepherd, by the way, means to watch out for other people, to rule, to govern, to lead, to guide, to direct a congregation. And the word is not a new term that the church would have heard for the first time. This is not something that they've never heard before. This is something they're familiar with. It's been used in Jewish thought for a long time. For instance, Moses and David, right? Moses in the 40 years, I think Abby mentioned a couple weeks ago. Moses in the 40 years in the wilderness was a shepherd. David was a shepherd before he was a king. The Lord is the shepherd, my shepherd, in Psalm 23. Israel's leaders were called shepherds, although they were bad shepherds. We see that example in Ezekiel 34. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to those shepherds, thus says the Lord God. Woe, shepherds of Israel who have been feeding themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flock? You eat the fat and clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fat sheep without feeding the flock. Those who are sickly you have not strengthened. The disease you have not healed. The broken you have not bound up. The scattered you have not brought back. Nor have you sought for the lost, but with force and with severity you have dominated them, the leaders of Israel, instead of pasturing them, instead of shepherding them. They were scattered for lack of a shepherd, and they became food for every beast of the field and were scattered. They were doing a poor job, and they would be judged for it. In the New Testament, Jesus is the good shepherd in John 10. And so these elders, and it's important we understand that they're the ones who are being addressed, these elders were to shepherd the flock. Now, this word shepherd is a verb, all right? And when it's an action. And it's the verb form of a noun for pastor. So that's the term from which we gain, like that's why we call our pastors pastor. We get it from this verb. All right. So we have the elders pastoring here. Now, Peter's writing this, and it brings to mind something that Jesus said to Peter in John 21. After his resurrection, when they'd finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, tend my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, shepherd my sheep. This is the term that Peter didn't forget. This is a charge that Peter didn't forget. I mean, listen, this is kind of a significant moment in Peter's life, right? This is kind of Peter's restoration after thrice denying Christ, 3 times being asked this question. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. Same word that we see here. Peter heard that charge from the Lord to shepherd his sheep, and he spent his life doing it. And here in 1 Peter 5, which is closer to the end of his life, he's now charging the elders of the church to do the same thing, to shepherd the flock. What we see here is that the elders and the pastors, the shepherds, it's the same office. It's the same office. You'll notice also who they're shepherding, whom they're shepherding. Shepherd the flock of God among you. It's not their flock. It's God's flock. It's God's people. They're shepherding God's flock. God has allotted them to their charge. They're responsible for something that belongs, or people that belong to God. And so this is a serious charge that's here. Peter calls these elders to shepherd the flock of God. But then, if you're like me, the first thing you might ask is, or a question that might come to your mind is, well, what does that look like? What does it look like to shepherd the flock of God? because a lot of people have a lot of different views about that. Some people think that the pastor needs to be their best friend. Some people think that he needs to visit every time they have the sniffles or, whatever else. Some people have all these wild ideas about what shepherding should and shouldn't be. If I miss on Sunday, the pastor should be calling me to see how I'm doing, or something like that, right? Because those are ideas that we kind of come up with, right? That's not something necessarily that we find in Scripture. We actually have this verb to shepherd, this command to shepherd the flock is modified by 3 different actions in verse 2. So we actually have a biblical picture of what that means and what that looks like, which I think is pretty cool. And, regardless of what people end up thinking, regardless of the views that they end up adopting, I think it's important that we look at what God actually says. Anyway, before we get in there, I want to mention something that Peter's actually, let me not go to that passage yet. I want to come back there. This word, let's do it. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight. All right, so this phrase I want you to this is, I would say this one's modified 3 times, really. But this one kind of clarifies that one. So they're shepherding and they're exercising oversight. Now that word, exercising oversight, is a verb form of the noun bishop or overseer. So the elders are to pastor and bishop. The elders are to pastor and oversee. You think if a man desires the office of a bishop, he desireth a good thing. If a man desires the office of an overseer, so what we have is the elders are also the pastors and the bishops. They're doing the same thing. And the overseers is one office. The pastor, elder, bishop is one office. That fact is also seen in Acts 20. Here, let's go there. Acts 20 and verse 28. And in Acts 20, the Apostle Paul is coming back from his 3rd missionary journey. He meets with the Ephesian elders in the town of Miletus. And he encourages these elders, and it's important that you understand that he's encouraging the elders. You have to go back to verse 17 to see that. He encourages them to be on guard for yourselves and for all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to shepherd the church of God. The elders of the church are overseers, bishops, King James translates it, and shepherds, pastors. The pastor, elder, bishop, same office. Now, there are some people that are confused about that today. So we believe in the Baptist distinctives, there are, there's the nice, beautiful acrostic. It says Baptists, right? And, look, I'm Christian before I'm like Baptist, but the Baptist beliefs are, I think the system is most consistent with what the Bible teaches. There is biblical authority, right? There's the autonomy of the local church, right? There's the priesthood of the believer, 2 ordinances, individual soul liberty, regenerate church membership. There's separation of church and state. There's 2 offices, right? These are some of the distinctives. It's not 1 or 2 of these things. It's the whole group of them that makes, a Baptist distinct from other groups, is holding to all of these beliefs. Well, 2 offices is pastor and deacon. Now, there are some churches that they see really kind of 3 offices. They see a pastor, an elder, and a deacon. And how it works is this, in their view. Technically, they claim most of the time that the pastor is one of the elders. So they'll hold to a plurality of elders, and the pastor answers to the elders. The problem with that, and then there are deacons, but in reality, what you have is that board of elders is, generally speaking, in most cases, there are some exceptions to this, but in many cases, they're just another group of deacons who rule the church. And by the way, in a lot of Baptist churches, they do it wrong. There's pastors and deacons, and the deacons run the church. And that's not it either. All right, that couldn't be further from what we see in the New Testament. Okay, the church governs the church, but the pastor is the spiritual leader. So in these churches where there's kind of like these three offices, this is how it works. The pastor submits to the board of elders. The pastor is held to a high, stringent qualification and oftentimes not always training. I mean, like, for instance, there are a lot of churches like the Calvary Chapel movement and other Pentecostal churches like them. They don't require any training from their pastors, but, in circles that are a little more theologically educated, they will require some training from the pastors and stuff like this. They don't hold the elder board to the same stringent qualifications that they hold the pastor to. They don't hold the board of elders to the same training qualifications that they hold the pastor to, all right? And so now you have the guy who is held to the most stringent qualifications, who is the most trained and educated, who is answering to people who aren't held to those same stringent qualifications, who are lesser trained. And think about that for a second. Would you run a business that way? You know what I mean? The heart surgeon is not going to be answerable to the nurse, right? Like, I hate to use the illustration that way, but that's kind of how the churches are running it. So there's the pastor, then there's the board of elders, which is just a group of lay deacons that have a different term, and then there are deacons. If you're going to do something like that, and you want to follow the scripture, then you should have two offices, and the elders and pastors should be an office where all the pastors, or you might call it a pastoral staff, that's what we would call it, where all the pastors are held to the same stringent qualifications, all right? So if you're going to hold this qualification for the guy who's going to lead your church, then you're going to hold it for the guy who's on the elder board. And the same general standard of education. So if you're going to expect your pastor to be seminary trained, then you should generally expect your elder board to be trained formally at some level as well. And even then, I would argue that board of elders or that board of pastors would ultimately be submitting to the pastor of the church, not the other way around. Now, the way we do it is I kind of gather myself with some guys who are spiritual guys, and when there are things that kind of come up, we'll have conversations, and we'll kind of work through things together. And sometimes I'll say things like, hey, what do you guys think? And I'll get their advice. And sometimes I follow that advice, and sometimes I don't. And sometimes I followed that advice and it was bad, and sometimes I followed that advice and it was good, and sometimes I didn't follow that advice and it was good. And we do the best we can, all right? But we believe in two offices. We believe in the pastor, elder, bishop, and that's what the New Testament teaches. And we believe in the office of a deacon. And fortunately, we have great deacons in this church. So the pastor is to oversee, to shepherd, and to oversee his flock. And we have here even more guidance. We have these stringent qualifications here, all right? First, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, right? So shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight. That is, this is really just an explanation of what shepherding is. Not under compulsion, but voluntarily. All right, so some pastors, maybe in Peter's day, they might have been pressured to take. Maybe they were the most spiritually mature people in the congregation, and they maybe felt pressure to take their congregations and forced into the role. That would disqualify them. Reminds me of one of my former pastors. This pastor, he wanted to be a youth pastor. He didn't want to be the pastor of a church. And he came and he was doing pulpit supply for the church, and the church loved him. And the church wanted this guy to be their pastor, and they kept on him until eventually he said, okay, and he became their pastor. But it became evident he never wanted to be a pastor. And so what ended up happening was that guy was so anxious to get out of pastoral ministry that he left the church in a worse situation than he found it. He left the church in a situation where he was kind of desperate to get out and leave it in other people's hands. He left it in the hands of a person who didn't really kind of believe the exact same way that the church had held to. And a few years down the line, really, most of the people in that church were gone. And the church took a completely different direction. Today, the church has taken a completely different direction than what it once had taken. And you could go back to a pastor who is no longer in ministry today, who never wanted to be the pastor in the first place. And he took the job under compulsion. Some of Peter's pastors might be in a similar situation and now facing hardships because of something never really won in the first place. But the first qualification of a pastor is, you see in 1 Timothy 3, it is a trustworthy statement. If a man aspires to the office of a bishop or overseer, it is a fine work he desires to do. If a man desires the office of a bishop, desire to want to be in ministry, and so he must be voluntarily willing to be in ministry. That's the first qualifier here. The second one that we see in 1 Peter 5:2 is, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness. And so he's not to desire dishonest gain. We see this all over pastoral qualifications. For instance, in Titus 1:7, it says that the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of sordid gain. Over in 1 Timothy 3, we see the same thing. Not addicted to wine or pugnacious, but gentle, peaceable, free from the love of money. Later in that same letter, Paul writes about how the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. I'm going to tell you, I've seen that. I've seen people's spiritual walks go right down the tubes because of money, or because of work, or because of a job that they took that got them more money but took them away from the Lord or whatever. I've seen it. But flee from these things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. The writer of Hebrews says this in Hebrews 13:5, make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have. And that contentment is found in Jesus Christ. Pastors were not to be in the ministry for money, and that could lead to misappropriation of funds and whatever. They were to be eager to do the work of the ministry, and they were to do it with the right motives, not for money. How can you not think of guys like Benny Hinn? How can you not think of the TV preachers and how it's just so clear, they're so disqualified, and the masses follow them? Third qualifier in 1 Peter 5, verse 3. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, not for sordid gain, but with eagerness, like a desire to do it. Nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. And so what we have here is that the pastor is not to be a domineering leader or a dictator, not lording it over those allotted to you. They should not become masters of the church. It's not their kingdom. They are, in fact, under shepherds to the chief shepherd. And that's something that Jesus had already taught Peter in Matthew 20 and verse 25. But Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And so what you have is Peter just repeating again what Jesus had already taught about servant leadership, not dictatorial leadership, not the master of the church. All right? Now, in the ancient world, in ancient Rome, you lead by force. But in Jesus' church, you lead by example. By example. The word means a model, a type, a pattern in moral life. We see servant leadership over and over and over again in the New Testament. Here's just a few passages. Philippians 3:17, brethren, join in following my example and observe those who walk in the pattern you have in us. In 1 Timothy 4:12, let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself and this is a pastoral letter, show yourself an example of those who believe. In Titus 2:7, another pastoral letter, in all things show yourself to be an example of good deeds, with purity and doctrine, dignified, sound in speech, and so on. The pastors, the elders are the pastors and the overseers. The pastor, elder, bishop, though, is not a dictator. He is a servant leader, and at least he's supposed to be, as an example to follow. And the congregations were to follow that example. And that's something we see in the New Testament too. Check it out, Hebrews 13:7. Remember those who led you, who spoke the word of God to you, and considering the result of conduct, imitate their faith. In our individualistic Christian world, this doesn't happen. A lot of people would just prefer to be, the church that thrives today is the megachurch. You can go to a megachurch and just be a number there. You can go and people not really know who you are, and fulfill your conscience, satisfy your conscience by getting your hour in, listen to your rock music, and listen to motivational speech, and then leave. And there's no real pastoring that happens in those churches. And as far as following a pastor, again, the narcissist goes to a church like that because he sees himself as being above. Why do I need to be accountable to anyone? Most people don't want to be accountable to a church, and most people don't want to follow anyone. Here, the elders of the church were to oversee their people. They were to shepherd the flock of God, exercising oversight. There was motivation standards that had to be met. There was a way in which they led that was servant leadership and not dictatorial, not a dictator. They lead by example, and all the while, they keep their eyes on the reward in verse 4. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Jesus is the chief shepherd. He is the shepherd and guardian. I think Peter used this term in chapter 2, the shepherd and guardian of our souls. The pastors, they are not the chief shepherds. They are under shepherds. It reminds me, I think it was last Christmas. I think it was last Christmas Eve. I think it was Kendall. Came up to me after the service. I think I've said this. Said something about, me owning the church. Right? We were on the way. She was on the way out the door, and she's like, "You own the church? Are you going to be locking it up tonight, or something like that?" And I'm like. I was like, no, I don't own the church. And she said, I thought you owned it. And I said, no, I don't own it. But I work for the one who does own it. God owns the church. In fact, if this church, let's just say, by the way, this church will I hope, should long outlast me. But at the rate that churches are dying today, you never know. My hope is that this church long outlasts me. And it existed long before I was a Christian. Okay, so if we were to fold, That is, if a church were to shut its doors, in our Constitution, it's laid out what we would do. No person gets anything. No member of the church. Money's not divided among the people, so the people don't own the church. The money's not given to the pastor doesn't own the church. What happens is everything gets sold and it all goes to another church. Because God is the chief shepherd. I'm an under shepherd, okay? And this church is owned by God, not any person. In the past, I've met people who were confused about that. Deacons in other churches who thought they owned it. I built that church. Oh, you built it, huh? You did. Yeah, I paid for that. Oh, you did it all by yourself, didn't you? Did you put the deed in your name too? You know, I mean, just some people just don't get it. They don't get it. It is God's flock, and he is the chief shepherd. And one day, when Jesus comes back, the under-shepherds will receive the unfading crown of glory. It's like a joke I'll often say, you go to a pastor's retreat. The running joke is, the pay isn't great, but the benefits are out of this world, right? So, get it? Nobody? It's a dad joke. It's a dad pastor joke. In New Testament, kids like, I don't get it. Get it? Eternity, eternal rewards, the benefits are out of this world. In the ancient world, the crown is given to a general when he wins a war. He would parade through town through the city with his crown of gold. The fleet would receive a laurel wreath as a victory trophy. And all those crowns and all those trophies will perish. It reminds me of Josh's team won the championship last spring, not the one that just passed the year before that. And you got a medal, right? I got a medal too. I got a medal. It was fantastic. I got a medal. It was because I was one of the coaches. I got a medal. And what is it? It's just like a piece of, I don't know, is it plastic? I don't know what it is. I don't even know what it is. You even know where yours is? I don't even know where mine is. It mattered a lot that day. I was like, oh yeah, this is awesome. We got, but it's just a thing. That's all it is. It's just a thing, and it's going to fade away, and it's going to end up in a pile of junk somewhere. And I don't know, maybe when you're an adult, you'll have that little thing. If the strap doesn't break by then, I don't know. But at the end of the day, it's going to fade away. Here, there is an unfading crown of glory. It will never lose its shine. It will never lose its luster. It's stored in a place where moth and rust doth not corrupt, nor where thieves break in and steal. It's an inheritance that is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you. It's like what the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Timothy 4:8, in the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appear, all who have looked for and longed for his return. It's as James writes in James 1:12, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. The New Testament elder must pastor his church, overseeing the spiritual state of God's people. He does this with godly motivations, as he leads as a godly example, and he looks for the return of Christ when he receives an unfading reward in glory. I would say if only modern church pastors would be more like what's in here and less like what Hillsong showed us, and less like what Jimmy Swaggart showed us. If only I could be more like, listen, I believe I'm a legitimate pastor, don't get me wrong. I joked this morning, Claudia had said something very nice about me as a pastor, and I said jokingly something like, hey, listen, I was just lucky enough to have tricked the congregation into letting me be their pastor. because I'm just a regular guy, just like everyone else. And every pastor is. And so, I think real pastors can look at a passage like this and say, I wish I could be even more like that. I wish I could be a better example than what I am. And if only people would look for and follow pastors like what we see in the pages of the New Testament and in this passage, instead of the hipster motivational speakers that parade themselves as pastors today. The pastor, elder, bishop must shepherd the flock, and he must do it in godliness. And that's the point of this passage tonight. So if you take your hymnals and turn to 355, we're going to close our service with a hymn. If you're not sure you're saved, then you be sure to come and see me.